If you can I just want to make sure that I mute my YouTube channel here once that goes live.
You ready? Yeah, you're live.
Okay.
You may have to hit refresh.
No? Oh, here we go.
You can I just want to make sure that I mute my YouTube
Where do I do that?
Once that goes live.
Oh, good.
You're live.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Sunday school class at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. My name is Gisela Kreglinger Smith. I'm married to Roy Smith, who has been attending St. Stephen's for a long time. Today, we will talk about early Celtic spirituality. It's a very, very rich tradition that has inspired the church throughout the ages. And especially for a time like this, I think the early Celtic tradition is very rich because the time that they lived and gathered as communities and monastic communities to worship and to evangelize, they were very, very difficult times. Politically very unstable, a lot of suffering, and yet these people gathered together to worship God and to be expectant for Him to be with them and to move and to direct them. So this is what we are going to talk today, and I would like to start off with a hymn. The Irish Church during this pandemic came together, 300 churches, to sing a blessing over the people. We don't have the video of it, but we do have the sound. So I'm going to play this for you. If you can just sort of take a deep breath and be open and receptive as we play this music from the Irish Church to us here in Birmingham.
Christ within you, Christ behind you, Christ before you, Christ beside you, Christ to live in you, Christ to comfort and restore you, Christ in me, Christ among you, Christ divine, Christ in danger, Christ in heart, Christ in love of friend and stranger. Go mami and cheer na hu, agus go goody sé hu. The Lord will lift away space, and the goodness of his heart to be breath upon you.
The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. مباركك الرب ويحرسك. Niech się Pan błogosławi i strzeże.
O Senhor faça resplandecer-os.
Facă să lumineze fața lui peste
Vichoneca.
Yehova, திருமுகம் நின்ற மேல் உயர்த்தி நினக்கு சமாதானம்
Cosi fuini alafia.
Well, that was the Irish Church speaking a Celtic blessing over us. I like this hymn so much because I think it captures a lot of the early Celtic spirituality. They had a great sense of God being with them in all. And so I hope you found this blessing inspiring and were nourished by it. So what I want to do today is I want to introduce you to the early Celtic tradition. Celtic spirituality is actually a very, very popular tradition to draw on even today, but there are a lot of romanticized versions of it that perhaps don't have as much to do with the early Celtic church as we think. And I wanted to be aware of that before I dive in and introduce you to that tradition. And I think those popular versions of Celtic spirituality often reflect our contemporary longings more than the early Celtic church, our longing for wholeness, our longing for a greater connection with the earth, for example, with God and each other. And I think that's really important to be aware of the longings that we have in our own day. But it's also really important to learn about a tradition on its own terms and understand who they were, what they expected of God, how they understood their mission in the world, and then draw some parallels in how we can learn from that tradition. So that's what I want to do. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to draw on a saint and what we know about that saint. And the saint today will be St. Patrick of Ireland. He has written some works himself, but a lot of what is written about him, we have to understand that in terms of hagiography. So they were writings about the saint that had a lot of theological reflections woven into it, and not everything that's written about him might be as historically accurate as we would understand it. But it's still very, very important to listen to the traditions. So I want to introduce you to St. Patrick of Ireland. And here we have a beautiful icon of him. He lived in the 5th century. We are not so sure about his dates, but they are from probably 415 through 492 or 93. And he was actually not from Ireland. He was from Britain. He comes from a family that was very well situated within the Roman Empire in Britain. And at the time that he and his family lived, the Roman Empire had moved into Britain and occupied it, and people were quite free to live within that context. And his family, his father and his grandfather, were very established in that, and he actually has profound Christian roots. His father was a deacon and his grandfather was a priest in the church. So the family that he comes from was already very Christian, but he himself wasn't so sure about the Christian faith. He was more of a cultural Christian. But just to give you the background, so the Roman Empire in Britain is where he came from, but the Roman Empire started crumbling, and in 410 they pulled back all their troops from Britain, and that left a political void. The infrastructure collapsed, and that made them vulnerable to raiders. So raiders came from Ireland and took advantage of that political void in Britain, and they actually captured Patrick and took him as a slave to Ireland when he was about 16. So he was a victim of human trafficking, something that's very contemporary. We live in a time where human trafficking is very, very common, very tragic, but even a place like Birmingham, it's a reality that we encounter and hear of. And not a lot of people know that that was St. Patrick's fate. He was a victim of human trafficking and was brought to Ireland, and he worked as a slave tending sheep. And so that's sort of the background that you need to be aware of. We don't think of St. Patrick and those saints having a fate like that. And it was actually during this time where he was in exile, where he was a slave and working for Irish clans probably, that he had a profoundly spiritual experience. It was in this very desolate place, and a place of suffering, being taken away from his family and all that he was familiar with, that he probably remembered the faith of his ancestors, and he cried out to God and had a profound spiritual experience. And I wanted to read you a little bit about what he wrote about that time. He reflects about his sort of state before he had this profound encounter with God while in slavery. And he writes, "I was like a stone lying in the deepest mire." He just had no vision of who God was. He probably had a very comfortable upbringing, coming from a well-to-do family. It was only when he was in a place of profound suffering that he suddenly realized how poor he really was, and that to find God was the greatest riches that he could have ever imagined. And so it was in this time of slavery that he developed a profound spirituality. In the solitude of tending sheep and probably working a lot of other things, he was not treated very well. But again, it was this very desolate place that became a place of encounter for him, in that he developed a very, very rich prayer life. Again, I want to read you from what's been passed down from St. Patrick. "I prayed frequently each day, and more the love of God and the fear of him grew in me, and my faith was increased and my spirit was quickened. And so that in the day I prayed up to 100 times, and almost as many in the night." So it was in this time of being a slave and being isolated that he turned to God and developed a rich prayer life, and where he could suddenly hear the voice of God. He communed with God and he heard him speak. And I think that's really important for us when we sort of are in exile in this COVID time, isolated. I mean, I'm stuck at home most of the time, My husband is a healthcare worker, and so we have to be very, very careful. And I try to go out as little as possibly exposed. And it's tough. I miss being able to go out and socialize the way I have before. And so this is a real opportunity for us to use this time, like St. Patrick did, to draw closer to God and to develop a richer prayer life. You know, when I feel isolated and lonely, to sort of turn that turmoil into prayer and develop a deeper prayer life, just like St. Patrick did. And so he lived like that for many, many years. And one day in a vision, God speaks to St. Patrick and said that he wants to take him home and that he is to leave his place of slavery and to escape, and that there will be a boat waiting for him to bring him back to England. And so that's what he did. He escaped. He went to the coast and got on a boat and went back to be with his family. Obviously, that took a while, but he did. He was able to escape, and he was reunited with his family, but his life was different. He didn't re-enter sort of the life that he had before, but he wanted to become a priest, and so he got ordained, and then he went to Gaul, which was what is modern-day Europe, and he studied theology, and they say he studied theology for 30 to 40 years. Can you imagine that? We just don't think of the early Celtic saints that way, but that's what he did. He studied theology. He devoted his life to learning about the Christian faith. And while he was doing that, he had another dream. And again, God spoke to him in that dream. And I wanted to read from that again, because that's where he heard the Irish calling him. They wanted him to come back. So here's what he writes. And it was there, I speak the truth, that I saw a vision of the night, a man named Victoricus, like one from Ireland, coming with innumerable letters. He gave me one of them, and I began to read what was in it. The voice of the Irish. And at that very moment, as I was reading out the letters opening, I thought I heard the voice of those around the wood of Focolot. That's where he had been as a slave, which is close to the Western Sea. It was as if they were shouting with one voice. O holy boy, we beg you to come again and walk among us. Now, how beautiful. He was a slave with Irish clans. They probably didn't treat him well, but he must have left a deep impression on them. They saw a holiness in him and a beauty, and they wanted him to come back and share the gospel with them. And so that's what he did. Out of this intense prayer life that he developed, he was able to listen to God and to respond to God's calling for him to return to the Irish and to preach the gospel to them. So this profound conversion experience that he had in this time of slavery opened up his life to God and grew a willingness in him to devote his whole life to God in preaching the gospel. So this is what we know about St. Patrick. He spent the rest of his life in Ireland, and it was a very, very rough barbarian context. The Irish clans were known to be very violent. There was a lot of tribal strife, and so it must have been very, very challenging for him to spread not only the gospel, but also the life that comes with the gospel, a life of peace and of kindness and of loving your neighbor and of laying down your life for the other. But this is St. Patrick's life, and there were many other missionaries that worked in Ireland, but not all of their names have been remembered or their tradition written down. So we only know about a few saints that were in Ireland at that time, but they had a profound impact. And what they did, they really gathered in small communities and focused their life on worship and prayer. And when we think about the monastic movement in the early Irish church, I think more than anything is that they devoted their life to worship, to praise God, and to a life of prayer. And so while in mainland Europe, you had both monastic movements, but you also had normal, what we would consider parishes, priests, people going out, and people lived a sort of normal life. In the Irish church, it was a monastic movement. They didn't marry. They devoted themselves to the communal life and to worship and learning. And learning is another really, really important of the early Irish church, that worship and prayer and learning and manual labor was sort of a triadic structure that they used to grow in their life of faith and then to spread the gospel to the Irish. So out of the Irish church, we have a lot of beautiful hymns, the poetry. We listen to a hymn, but I'm going to introduce you to a beautiful Irish text called St. Patrick's Breastplate. It's associated with St. Patrick, but the first association of this particular prayer with St. Patrick was only in the 11th century, but probably sort of maybe a more simple version was what St. Patrick's wrote down. And so you can get a glimpse for their passion for poetry and for worship and hymns, but also for the profound theology that they had in the early Celtic church. They thought very hard about God, and that sort of studying about God led into an even deeper way of worship and praise. So what I want to do now is I want to read and prayerfully read St. Patrick's Breastplate to you. And then afterwards, I am going to talk a little bit about the theology that they had. And again, I think it's a theology that is very much something that we can draw on for our day, especially during these challenging times that we've experienced, both politically with the election that we just had, which was very, very difficult for a lot of us, and the strife that came with it, but then also with the pandemic that we are experiencing. Friends and family that have gotten ill, and we don't know what we can do. We have to isolate ourselves, and yet we can pray, and we can call upon God to intervene. And maybe more than anything else, I think the early Celtic church had a profound sense that God was present and at work, that the physical world was saturated with the spiritual for them. God was everywhere. And they were expectant that God was going to intervene. And I find that really inspiring, and I want to grow in that expectancy in my own life. And I hope that this class will help you to become more expectant that God not only is present, but that He's active and that He wants to draw us closer to Himself. So let us pray together as I read this St. Patrick's Breastplate. I bind to myself today the strong virtue of the invocation of the Trinity. I believe the Trinity in the unity, the creator of the universe. I'm going to try if I can get to this next slide up. Here we go. I bind to myself today the virtue of the incarnation of Christ with His baptism, the virtue of His crucifixion with His burial, the virtue of His resurrection with His ascension, the virtue of His coming on the judgment day. I bind to myself today the virtue of the love of seraphim, in obedience of angels, in the hope of the resurrection unto reward, in prayers of patriarchs, in predictions of prophets, in preaching of apostles, in faith of confessors, in purity of holy virgins, in deeds of righteous men. I bind to myself today the power of heaven, the light of the sun, the brightness of the moon, the splendor of fire, the flashing of lightning, the swiftness of wind, the depth of sea, the stability of earth, the compactness of rocks. I bind to myself today God's power to guide me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to teach me, God's eye to watch over me, God's ear to hear me, God's word to give me speech, God's hand to guide me, God's way to lie before me, God's shield to shelter me, God's host to secure me against the snares of demons, against the seduction of vices, against the lusts of nature, against everyone who mediates injury to me, whether far or near, whether few or with many. I invoke today all these virtues against every hostile, merciless power, which may assail my body and my soul, against the incantations of false prophets, against the black laws of heathenism, against the false laws of heresy, against the deceits of idolatry, against the spells of wizards and smiths and druids, against every knowledge that binds the soul of man. Christ, protect me today against every poison, against burning, against drowning, against death wound, that I may receive abundant reward. Christ with me. Christ before me. Christ behind me. Christ within me. Christ beneath me. Christ above me. Christ at my right. Christ at my left. Christ in the fort. Christ in the chariot seat. Christ in the deck. Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me. Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks to me. Christ in every eye that sees me. Christ in every ear that hears me. I bind to myself today the strong virtue of an invocation of the Trinity. I believe the Trinity in the unity, the creator of the universe. Now I've come back to this prayer over and over in my life, especially in hard times. And I love how the prayer starts with an invocation of the Holy Trinity and it ends with an invocation of the Holy Trinity. So our whole lives and what we experience is sort of framed and hidden in God, who is the beginning and the end of all things. So I want to talk a little bit about their theology and their understanding of the Trinity. I love how the early Celtic Christians drew on the pagan tradition. Here you see a pagan piece of art. They had a lot of triadic structures in their art. And the early Celtic Christians didn't reject that art. But what they did, they took that art and they reinterpreted in light of their own understanding of God. And so they used this pagan art to talk about the Trinity in these circles. And the understanding of the Trinity was very, very important to the early church, not just in the Celtic tradition, but also in Europe in the early church. And in the Council of Nicaea, they really talked about and established the teaching of the Trinity. And it is so interesting to see how sort of that teaching is brought into the Celtic church and how they wove that into their liturgy and into their poetry. So for them, the Trinity was this ever-present reality of God from the beginning to the end, and really saturating all of reality in all of their lives. And in the sort of pagan tradition in the Druids, they often drew circles to sort of create a spell. If they wanted to cast a spell on someone, that they would draw a circle. And then the Christians used the circle to reinterpret it as a blessing. The circle is how God surrounds us and blesses us and keeps us and redeems us. And I think that's beautiful. I love how they reinterpret the tradition, and how the circle, rather than being a spell and dark forces that capture you, are now a place of blessing, and how you are enfolded by the love of God. So I think that's really, really beautiful. The other part of the prayer that I wanted to draw attention to is it's a prayer of protection. They very much saw the need for protection. Not only were they exposed to the elements in ways that we can't imagine. We are all cozied up in the winter in our house. We have electricity, we have light. They weren't. I don't know if you've been to Ireland. I haven't, but I've lived in Scotland for many years. And I tell you, in the wintertime, the winds are fierce. The north wind is icy and cold. And so they were harmed by the fierce weather and needed protection from it. So that's one dimension of it. But the other one is there were a lot of enemies, both other tribes, and they could have easily gotten killed because they were very violent, but also dark spiritual forces. They believed in the devil. You know, often we sort of tame this idea that there are dark forces out there in sort of a late modern world. We're very rationalized people. We don't want to believe in a devil or dark forces or that we could be attacked by them. But they very much believed in that. They believed in the devil. They believed in dark forces that could attack them. And so they prayed daily for God's protection to surround them. And I think for our time, I find that very, very inspiring and comforting. It's been a difficult time, and especially with social media and what we are exposed to today, conspiracy theories and sort of false claims. And the whole idea of truth is something that's questioned today. And to have a prayer like that, to pray that God would protect us against false prophets and false teaching, and to surround us with His truth. And I think that's very, very important for our day. Or with the virus, that God would protect us from the virus and seal us into His presence. I really hope that you will look up St. Patrick's breastplate and print out that prayer and start praying it for a time like this. So just like they were in the early Celtic church, so are we exposed to a lot of dangers. Maybe they are different in some ways. We don't experience sort of the weather the way they do, but we do experience attacks of various sorts. And to pray for protection is very, very important. The other beautiful part of this prayer is how they envision their lives to be hidden in Christ. They had a very Christocentric vision of life in the Christian life, in that Christ was with them. that Christ dwells within us, but he's also all around us. He's ever present with us, that we're never alone in the darkness, but that we can call upon Christ, and that it really is about becoming more aware of how much Christ is with us every day and in every aspect of our lives. Whether we are safe or whether we are in danger, he is present with us and he surrounds us and protects us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this last part of St. Patrick's breastplate again because it's so beautiful. Here it is. And that's really what I want to send you off as we worship today and as we go into the week, that we have a much greater vision of God being with us. I think that's the danger, that we forget. It's so easy to forget, to be absorbed in all that's happening in the world, in what we read on social media, to forget that the invisible Christ is always with us. Let us pray. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ at my right, Christ at my left, Christ in the fort, Christ in the chariot seat, Christ in the deck, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks to me. Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. I bind to myself today the strong virtue of an invocation of the Trinity. I believe the Trinity in unity, the creator of the universe. So be blessed as you go into the Sunday. It's St. Nicholas Day today. Another wonderful early saint. And I do hope that you can envision yourself being surrounded by Christ, that he upholds you and sustains you in the good times and in the challenging times. So I think I'm going to end here. I would love to answer any questions that you might have. You can write comments, and I am going to read and see if you have any questions. I will try and answer them, or if you want to comment about what I've just shared or have any questions about the early Celtic tradition, here is a little bit of time for us to address them. And we can also send you a link to the video of that hymn that I played in the beginning. There's a lovely video that goes with it. And 300 churches from all over Ireland sort of came together to create this music video. So it's really fun to sort of watch the different participants and the instruments that are playing. I've listened to it many, many times. And so we can send that out to you, a link to the video, perhaps also with St. Patrick's breastplate. When you feel discouraged or you need some uplifting, I highly encourage that you watch this. Well, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to wait a little longer. I will continue next week. We will talk more about the early Celtic Church and their worship and how they used the arts in worship to lift up our hearts. I think when I can easily get sort of sucked into ways of thinking that are not very uplifting, moving into a place of anxiety and fear during times like this, and to have art helps me to refocus. All right, I don't see any questions. How long was Patrick in Ireland? Well, he moved to Ireland and then he stayed there and died there. A lot of the early Celtic saints saw going to another country and being a missionary there as a sort of sacrifice and a lifelong pilgrimage. So they quite radically turned away from their families and all that was familiar to them and saw this as their sacrificial offering to God in the church to be and remain with the people that they ministered to. Oh yeah, the translation that I'm using, it's I'm going to send that to you, but it's translated from the original, so it's not sort of a popularized version, and I like that because it brings out a little bit more of the earthiness of the early Celtic church. When St. Patrick's returned to Ireland, how powerful were the Druids? How did St. Patrick deal with the influence of the Druids? The way we know about the Druids is primarily through Christian writing. So we can only infer from that. But the Druids were, a group of people that did a lot of things. They had, they were very familiar with probably the herbs and medicinal wisdom that they had at the time. They were sages, but they also could cast spells. And so they had a very powerful place in the pagan society, but not always in a very good way. People were very suspicious. And so it's very difficult to sort of have a very clear picture of them because we only know about them through the Christian writing and maybe some of the writing of the Romans. The pagans did not write down material. The way they passed things on was orally, so we don't have sort of original material. But certainly from the Christian tradition, we know that the casting of spells seem to have a real hold on people, and people did feel caught in that. And also, the pagans brought sacrifices to the gods, and actually they brought human sacrifices, which is not something that is, that's very disturbing. And I often think about that for them, that Christ was the ultimate sacrifice, that someone else had brought a sacrifice that was sufficient, must have been very, very liberating to them, so that they wouldn't have to guess what kind of sacrifice they needed to bring, or in a real big crisis, they did bring human sacrifices. So I think for the pagans that flocked, in great numbers to the Christians, that must have been very, very liberating. What role did Patrick play in uniting the clans? We don't know. We don't have any information on that. But he obviously converted people from clans, and then people became, out of those conversions, people became monks, and then they would go back to their clans and evangelize them. There were a lot of women from clans that became Christians, and they had a big impact on their husbands and helped evangelize Ireland. So that's really, really interesting that a lot of sort of noble women became Christians, and then they in turn had a big impact on the church. Well, let me see if there's another question. I can't see. any more questions. So I think we are going to stop here. I will be back next week. If you have more questions, you can send them to me and also then write them in the comments section next week. So thank you so much for being with us today on this class on early Celtic spirituality, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Controls. Here?